Hey, everybody. It's Chris and Rick Talk Guitars, and we have a special guest today, Nick Millward, a stalwart of the Seattle music scene, fronts a great band called the Riffbrokers, and he's a great old friend, and we are going to have a killer conversation with him today, delving into everything music, everything else that we can think of. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here on the pod. I've been a fan for a while, and a good friend of, Chris is actually in that band, the Riffbrokers.
That's right.
And I've known you for a long time, Rick. And you're mutual friends with an old friend of mine from you guys go back to the 80s, you and Eric Olson.
Yeah.
When you were in the Puget Sound, and he was in the so many bands. I forget. What was it? The one where he had the big hair?
The Eager Tones.
Yeah. It escaped me for a second.
Yeah.
But yes, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm real excited to be part of this pod because I'm a fan of the pod as well.
Well, dude, thanks so much. We appreciate it. To start it off, I just want to kind of get your story, dude. Like, I know you're from Idaho originally. What got you into music in the first place?
Well, both my mom and dad played guitar, and they had a great record collection. They weren't together, so I kind of bounced back and forth, excuse me, between the two households growing up. So I went to school in Pocatello, that's southeastern Idaho, and then spent the summers with my dad in the Sun Valley area. And they were both, hippies that had great vinyl collection, from the 60s and the 70s of, everything from the Beatles and Bob Dylan and the Byrds into the singer-songwriter stuff like John Prine and Jerry Jeff Walker, Guy Clark. From the time I was 4 years old, I was singing John Prine songs instead of like Sesame Street songs or whatever in the early mid 70s. So I'm 10 years younger than you guys. I was born in 71. That's kind of where I got turned on to music. And then by the time I was about 6 years old, and about 78 is when I really discovered the Beatles. I remember getting this big illustrated book that I still have about the Beatles' career at a bookstore when I was 6. I don't know what, it was like some weird past life regression thing. I have no idea, but I was just kind of like stuck, like feeling from the time I was a child, I was born in the wrong era. So that was a big deal, just kind of getting lost in front of the family stereo. And I really wanted to be left alone so I could listen to those records without anybody looking at me, because I was very self-conscious about how emotionally charged the situation was when, like the needle dropped and you hear the scratches on the vinyl, and then the first chords kick into I Want to Hold Your Hand, that that C to D, and then the hand claps, and just like all those sounds were just so mystical and, mind altering to me. And it was kind of scary at the same time. I mean, you look at the cover of that album, Meet the Beatles, and it has sort of that worn halo because it, been in so many shelves for so long.
Yeah.
So those 4 half moon faces staring at you, and they're very somber looking and very sinister, kind of crazy. That just like flipped the switch for me as far as the power of music and the mystery and the, behind watching that disc circle around with the rainbow label and the sounds and all the mechanics of the needle and stuff is just, I don't think you ever forget that.
Well, I think it's so cool that you mentioned that, because I have a very similar experience. Even though we were born 10 years apart, my parents had a record collection. My dad was a World War II guy, so he had a bunch of old big band stuff like Louis Armstrong, Stan Getz, Miller, all that stuff. But my mom was younger than him, so for some reason the Beatles album they had was Sgt. Pepper, and so I would do the same thing. I'd sit with the headphones and listen to that thing, and I was super young. I didn't know, I was processing it similar to you were processing it. Like, what is this? Like, I had enough wherewithal to know it was good and or feel it was good, but it was just so same thing, mystical, watching that thing spin around, hearing the sounds. And then I did get Meet the Beatles after that too. And it's funny, everything you said totally resonated with me. The cover, the song. So It's just cool to hear you say that. And I think that's the power of getting exposed to music at a generational level, that fascinates me, whether it's older siblings or parents or, relatives.
At that time that I was getting into that was the era when like Kiss was the actual band that maybe I should have been turned on to. And they scared the shit out of me, man. Like they seemed like scary ass monsters because, if I was a teenager at that time, like you guys were, I would have been all like, cool. Yeah, right on. But as a child in the mid to late 70s, I'd see Kiss on TV or whatever. And I was just like, I was a very timid, fearful child of everything. And they were just like way too scary for me. It was like, I couldn't cross over to them.
That's funny.
So it's so weird, that should have been probably my jam at that time, but it wasn't.
Chris, did you have similar experience kind of getting introduced to music, like from your parents' record collection or siblings or?
Not my parents really didn't have a record collection. All the music when I was a young kid came to me from the kitchen radio, which was on, and mostly my memories are from the summer of stuff pouring out of the kitchen radio. But when I really started exploring music on my own, it was from my best friend's older brother, who had a collection of, half of that, his record collection is now in my record collection, the same records. It's just like it became my reference point for everything I ended up exploring as a young, music fan. Everything's like, that's where I've heard David Bowie, Mott the Hoople, Lou Reed, all of these artists, Kiss. He gave me, he was like 10 years older than my best friend, and he gave us the first Kiss record because he's like, take this is children music. And we just loved it. That became our band. And like Nick was just saying, 10 years prior to him, Nick finding the Beatles, we found Kiss. And that for a good 2 years was our band. It was like perfect kid music. It rocked. It had hooks. And there was this comic book element to it that we just totally fell for. And that ran its course of about 2 years. And then I thought the same thing as his older brother eventually, like this is children's music. And I moved on. So.
That's awesome.
Yeah, my parents had no records. My mom did buy us like record players at some point and records. And I remember this very clearly. She bought me John Denver's greatest hits, Jim Croce's greatest hits, and then some of those like K-Tel samplers that had a bunch of stuff on it. So that was like my first records I owned. And then from there, I met my best friend, and that's when I found rock and roll, and the rest is history. Or history.
Well, Nick, you also play guitar.
Yeah.
And were you influenced by both parents playing the guitar? Did that resonate with you, or how did you get attracted to the guitar?
Here's funny. It's really roundabout because I was so into the Beatles thing. The first thing that hit me was Ringo's drumming, and I wanted to be a drummer. And I actually, in 6th and 7th grade, I played drum in the band and school band because, guitar was a thing I was kind of shy from because it seemed like in order to be a guitarist, you had to be out front. And I was a very shy kid. I was like, well, I'm really into music, but man, that's a lot of pressure to be the guy in front, which is ironic. This is what I actually became a front guy. But my whole thing was, I love the way that hi-hat sounds and that shit, like if I'm going to be part of a band, I want to be part of that cool thing that happens behind the scenes, then I'll be kind of safer behind the other guys or whatever. That was kind of my fantasy. There was no way that my parents were going to afford a full drum kit for me. And there was nowhere I was going to practice. It was too loud.
Right.
And so at that time, I was interested in guitar, and my mom and my dad showed me chords, and it was about that shift. It was that year of 83, 84, when I was 12 years old, that it was like, my future with drums is not going to materialize. I can see that. And it's just a lot easier to go with guitar. There was this music store downtown Pocatello called Mike's Music, and that was a music store that had all the sheet music that you needed to get for school, and they had flutes and the extra reeds and guitar strings, all that stuff. But they had this great side room. They had like these electric guitar racks, and they were on the floor level. They weren't hanging on the wall. They were like 2 rows of 10 guitars or something, and those sort of, floor racks. So you could just sneak back there and grab an electric and plunk on it. It was just like this little magical place. So that's when I made the decision to actively get one. And it wasn't from that store. It was from a different pawn shop in Pocatello called Shamrock Coins. I saw a Sunburst Ibanez Strat copy hanging up behind the counter, and it was only like $230. And I saved up my money. My mom helped me get that, and we put it on layaway. And it was one of those things I was putting money down every week and looking forward to it. And it was something I dreamt about. And I was just like thinking about that guitar. And I was selling cookies and candies door to door to make money to get it. and I've told this story a bunch of times. Chris is probably sick to death of it. But so I was in 7th grade, and Van Halen was coming to town on the 1984 tour. And they played the Mini Dome in May. And my buddies were like, "Hey, are you going to go to the Van Halen concert?" And I was like, "No, I'm going to save every last dime for this guitar. So I'm not going to go to this Van Halen concert so I can get this guitar out a week earlier or whatever. I'm really close." So the concert came and went. The kids showed up at the school the next day with the cool tour T-shirts, and I didn't have one. But I was like, I still have that guitar. So that was something that I don't regret.
Well, that's dedication, man, to a cause, to get that guitar. So you got this guitar. Did you take lessons, Paul, or had you kind of already known how to play based on your parents playing acoustic and you maybe plunking around on that?
Before that guitar, about a year before I got that guitar, my dad got me one of those nylon string Spanish kind of acoustic guitars, or whatever. And I hated it because it had like this really wide fretboard, and it was really hard to, and it's just, I don't know if you guys enjoy those kind of guitars, but I never had. It's like, shit, this thing's hard to play and it's weird. And my mom said, "Well, I'm going to sign you up for these classical lessons." So the first lesson, the guy had me put my foot up on this little pedestal thing, and I had to hold the guitar a certain way, like Andre Segovia or some shit. And I had to read sheet music and plunk, 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 play it like a piano. And I was like, fuck this, man. This is bullshit. Like, I do not like this guitar. I do not like this approach, And I ended up putting that guitar in the yard when we had a yard sale one weekend. My dad found out about it and he was pissed, but I was like, I hated that thing, like I wanted nothing to do with it. So as soon as I got the electric guitar, it was about the same time for Christmas I got one of those that I still have too, this complete Beatles songbook that had all the chord charts in it for every song. And this book is dilapidated. I've had it for 35 years or more, and it's just held together with duct tape and just completely fallen apart. All the sheets are loose. But I did self-study on that. That was the hugest thing of learning how to play guitar, was just how to make those chord shapes, how to eventually get my index finger to make those bar chords for those B minors and C sharp minors that are in all those songs, to make it happen, to come alive. Music for me didn't really take off until I learned those chord shapes that were in those tablatures, and I never would have had the discipline or patience to sit and learn from anybody. It was all self-study of figuring that stupid stuff out. And that was, what informed me for my whole guitar lifetime. But what was going on at the time was, Eddie Van Halen, Yngwie Malmsteen, Kirk Hammett, and there was no way I admired that stuff, but there was no way, if I knew how to do that, if I knew how to go wheelie wheelie or tap or fucking make my fingers dance up and down the fretboard, I would have been on it. I would have been the cool guy to impress all my friends or whatever girl would be around. But that wasn't happening for me. I was like in my own shell, very self-consciously figuring out chords because it was just like being closeted, like I would have been ruthlessly mocked and ridiculed for, adhering to the kind of music I want to learn how to play.
I think it's super cool though that the bedrock of your playing is that music. I think it's cool because that, as we all know now, well, I mean, we kind of knew it then too, that's kind of, for me anyway, Beatles is one of the high bars of like just songwriting for pop music. So to kind of be steeped in that at an early age, I think is really cool and fortuitous for you because, regardless of how you ended up there, you know what I mean? Because, I mean, I was into that too when I was younger, but I was also still in my formative years when the guitar god shit was going on, or even before that, Hendrix. I mean, I totally dug Hendrix, but just as a songwriter, I think it's cool that you are steeped in like kind of songwriter music,
It was huge learning those chord progressions because I kind of knew from, my parents listening to country and folk and stuff growing up, your dad shows you 3 chords, C, F, G, all of a sudden you know what the 1, 4, 5 is. And it made sense to me. Oh, G, C, D, that's another 1, 4, 5. I didn't know what 1, 4, 5 was at that time, but I understood the concept of this chord progression is the same thing in blues, country, folk, like you see it repeated over and over.
Yeah.
And it's like the basis of, and you could just learn 3 chords and that's the truth, right? But what the Beatles showed me is like, well, we can do the 1, 2, 6, 5, whatever. They throw in these minor bar chords that it's like, well, it changes everything. Like, wow. And it, it changes the mood. And so it was never for me about playing really fast scales up and down the neck. It was like the emotional feeling of how when these chords change, how that tugs at your feelings.
You were drawn to some cool shit when you were young, Chris.
As Nick was saying that, I was kind of laughing to myself about a joke I'd made shortly after I joined the Riffbrokers, because up to that point, everything that I was playing in my own music and stuff that I was just drawn to listen to was more based around like the Stones and the Faces and those kind of chord progressions there, just like pure, rock and roll, kind of roots-based rock and roll. Yeah. And when I joined the Riffbrokers, that's where Nick's Beatle chords started coming at me. And I came up with this joke is, how do you stop a Stones-based guitar player? Just throw a Beatle chord at him. And it took me a while to figure out how to deal with these weird-ass chords. And, and in the end, it was really great because I just learned how to, play around different chords a little different and taking those weird chords in the middle 8 or wherever they are and finding out what makes them tick. And, where I would usually just do some Stonesy type riffing stuff is like there's a note in that chord that just gives it its entire essence. So I'm going to find that and incorporate that into my melody. And it was great. It threw me for a loop for a while, but eventually I got over it. So now I'm kind of a Beatle chords fan now. And it really makes the song. I mean, just one of those, like, a major chord to the same chord minor is so powerful in the context of a song, and learning how to play over that so that your melody captures the essence of that chord progression is just a great thing for me.
Well, I think it's funny too. Like I'm the same. I'm an introvert, and I was the same way, Nick, as a child, super shy, like painfully shy. I didn't want to stand out in any way, shape, or form. So I always think it's fascinating that people like us are drawn to be in a band and play in front of other people.
Right.
Talk a little bit about that transition for you in terms of being that shy kid, loving music, feeling compelled to play it, and then how did you get into bands and start wanting to perform?
Okay, so this is how that went. So I was, through my teenage years, high school years, I went back and forth between my electric guitar and my acoustic guitar, and I kind of just did my own thing by myself. But my mom had a coffee house, and she actually had folk people play there. And so we had Ramblin' Jack Elliott, of all people, came through town and played at our coffee house. And my mom one of her friends had a son, and these guys were older. They were in college, and they had this band that was called Syzygy, and that term is an astronomical term about planets lining up or something. It's really woo-woo, folky. But they got together with a few originals, and there were 3 of them on acoustic guitars and 1 guy on bongos, and they were doing a lot of Crosby, Stills, Nash stuff because they really liked working on their harmony thing. And they were just like idealistic college guys that wanted to have a folky kind of band. And, they knew that I played, and I had access to the stand-up bass that my dad had. And it was just this old beat-up Doghouse stand-up with 2 scratches on the neck, one for the 3rd fret, one for the 5th. And I learned as a kid how to do, the eat shit bass line of the 1 5 1 5, that country back and forth kind of thing. So they approached me and said, "Hey, would you like to be a part of this?" I was like, "Shit, hell yeah." I jumped at the chance. I was only 16 at the time, but I was able to play a few shows at my mom's coffee house. And then there was some sandwich shop that we played. And then we actually snuck me into a bar, played 1 bar gig, just, under the radar for me being underage. And that was really great. And then I about 4 to 6 months into it, it kind of just fizzled out, because I was 16. I wanted to kind of do more punk rock stuff. So it kind of just ran its course. And then I, finished high school, and I didn't really have any direction as far as going to college or whatever. I moved to the town where my dad was, and I was just kind of directionless until I met some kids that were into drugs and heavy metal and stuff. And the only way I could actually play music with other people is bass, because nobody wants to play bass, right? So somehow I got a hold of a Music Master, like a really short scale yellow Fender bass, and a really shitty Gorilla amp or something. And I was in this band called Ball Peen and the Violent Lobotomies. and that was like 1991. We played a few parties or whatever. And, that kind of ran its course too, until I was fed up with this small town scene, and I finally made my way to Boise when I was about 21. There came a point where I made a decision to be my own guy and write my own songs and be the front guy. And fortunately, at that time, it was the right time for me to find my people, find people that could play with me, that could figure out, and at that time I was into more garage rock, Billy Childish, sort of like classic rock and roll meets punk rock and garage stuff. And there was, an actual niche. It was actually, there's people that I can find that I can make bridge across these gaps of these people I couldn't find for the longest time in fucking shit kicker, Idaho.
Was there a pretty vibrant music scene in Boise at the time?
Oh yeah. So that was when Doug Marsh moved back to Boise from Seattle after the Tree People. And that's when Built to Spill took off.
Oh, got it.
And so I just happened to show up at the same time all that shit was happening. And so there was Caustic Resin, Butterfly Train. There was a definite, cohesive scene that had been thriving since the early 80s. And it was an exciting time for Boise. It's a small town, so you know everybody, but I wasn't like in any cool bands. That I was in the band that people made fun of. But, that was, it was just exciting enough and vibrant enough to where it was like, fuck, I'm finally in a place and time where there's something happening. And so I did that and was part of that whole scene for like 7 years until I moved to Seattle. Yeah.
So that was the 90s, the early 90s when you came to Seattle?
No, the 2000.
Oh, 2000. Okay. Got it.
The 90s when I went to Boise. I showed up in Boise in late 92 and I left in early 2000. When I first moved to Seattle, I was doing open mics, but I was lucky enough so Eric Olson, we talked about him earlier.
Yeah.
I knew him before. I was actually pen pals with him because when I was on tour with my band from Boise, you remember the Gibson House down on 2nd and Stewart?
Yeah.
So our band played there a couple times, and the last time we played there was with Eric's band, Lower 48. And we hit it off, after he liked my band and I liked his band. And so it was before I really had email. We were pen pals when we went back to Boise. And so when he made the decision to move to Seattle, he was like my guy and my contact. And through him, he had just recorded at Egg Studio, Conrad's place over there near in the Bryant neighborhood. And Johnny Sangster was the engineer. And when I finally was, wanting to record, he pushed me that direction, which was huge. Meeting with Ole, and being introduced to people, and finally getting into Egg Studio and recording with Johnny just opened so many doors, because then it's just like, it wasn't a matter of time before we got our drummer and we got playing around town, meeting Kurt Block. It just sort of just opened up that whole tribe of people. To this day, Scott Sutherland, was, after I saw the Model Rockets, I walked up to him and gave him a copy of our CD that we recorded at Egg, and he was in a bad mood because he just found out he was going through a divorce that day. It was a weird timing of like meeting people, but we had a show in 2001 at the Break Room with Evangeline, and I don't know if we met Chris before that or not, but blown away by Evangeline.
I didn't know that's how you and Chris met.
Yeah, Chris, chime in here, because I don't know if we met before that, or what's your memory?
That was actually when we met. It was a Break Room show, and I remember, and we hadn't played together. We didn't play together for a while, but I remember you and Heather came up to me, and I think you mentioned something about capos. It's like, look, he's using a capo or something like that. Because I guess you hadn't seen a band in Seattle yet that had used a capo in like a rock context.
Right. Yeah. And I got into my capo phase before I moved, in my last years in Boise, because I got really deep into the Rubber Soul album again and started reading a lot about it. And that was the first Beatles album where they went to town with capos and got all those really high chimey sounds.
I do have to add my one favorite Nick Millward guitar gear story.
Oh, here it comes. Here it comes.
This is the story that was related to me by Nick, is back when you ordered your yellow Les Paul Special, double cut special. I don't remember the retailer you ordered it from, but you cut the picture of the guitar that you ordered out of the advertisement and carried it around in your wallet until it arrived.
And I was just thinking about that the other day. It was Musician's Friend, because I think I ordered something from them, and the catalog would come in the mail on a regular basis. And I just gotten my red one, the special with the two P100s in it a couple years before. And I flipped through that Musician's Friend and saw for $5.99 back then, it was 2003. Gibson had just started making those faded series of those juniors.
Uh-huh.
And it was like supposed to be a faded TV yellow double cut junior. And I got infatuated with it. And it's true, dude. I cut it out of the thing and I had it in my wallet. I was looking at it and I was like, I'm going to get this. And I saved it up. It was just like I was 12 years old again, even though I was 32 years old. and I take it with me, and I remember showing it to a guy at a show down at the Comet Tavern. I think it was Stu Miller. And I was like, I'm getting this guitar, man. I can't wait till it comes. And it came, and I still have it. I still love it. And I'm the first owner. It's the only guitar that I've been the first owner of.
That's the beauty of guitars. It turns you into a 12-year-old every time. I mean, and anything in our lives that we can have that's like that, I'm 100% for.
Yeah. That's what I would take away from being a guitarist, is those magical moments of, like, if my house was on fire, you would grab these objects and run out. You would risk your life to grab these certain objects because you have such an emotional connection with them. It's weird.
Yeah.
They're more than stuff. It's much more than just stuff. I have lots of stuff. I don't care about stuff, but guitars are different.
Yeah. I love it. Well, dude, I want to thank you for being on the show because it's just so fun to talk about, your history and how you got into music and guitar and everything else. And that's the stuff that Chris and I really dig is just hearing, people talk about what these things mean to them and how it relates to guitar and music and everything else. So yeah, I want to thank you so much for being on the show and thanks for listening out there. Check us out on chrisandricktalkguitars.com and on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you guys so much.
Thanks, Nick.
All right, let's hear that Room Full of Guitars song.